My son-in-law always chuckled at my old belongings, especially at the coat I'd worn since the days I drove a truck across the country. To him, it was a symbol of poverty and a past he wanted to erase. But he didn't know there was a letter sewn into the lining. His name was the first thing written on it. And that letter wasn't a memory. It was a fate he couldn't outrun. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Jonathan Crawford. I had just turned 76 when the snow started falling early that year. I lived alone in a one-story house on the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, the same house I had bought in 1981 when I was still hauling freight for McKinney Transport. I had driven long-haul trucks for over 35 years, across 46 states, through dust storms in Arizona and black ice in Montana. The job had worn out my back, thickened my fingers, and left my hearing a little dull from decades of engine growls and highway wind. But even in retirement, I kept one thing from those days: my coat. It hung by the front door like a quiet sentinel. Dark gray wool, double-stitched shoulders, black buttons dulled by time. It was frayed around the cuffs, and the inner lining had torn in one spot under the arm. It smelled faintly of fuel and old paper, but it still fit me just right. That coat had been with me through layovers in truck stops, silent nights in the cab, and long waits for snowplows on I-70. It wasn't fashionable. It wasn't clean. It wasn't warm, either. But it was mine, and it had been mine longer than almost anything else in my life. Longer than I had been a husband, longer than I had been a father, longer than I had been old. I didn't wear it often anymore. The furnace in the house worked well, and I didn't go out much. But some mornings, when the wind scratched the windows and the roads looked like bone, I would put it on, just to feel the weight of it again. It was like armor, like history draped over my shoulders. No one ever commented on it anymore, not since Helen passed. She used to say it made me look like an old poet. I wasn't sure what she meant, but it was the only compliment that coat ever got. There was something else, too, something I had never told anyone. Inside the lining, stitched between the outer wool and the silk interior, was a letter. I had hidden it there nearly 2 decades ago, folded 3 times, wrapped in plastic, sealed with yellowing tape. I could feel the slight crinkle of it if I pressed my palm against the inner chest. Over the years, the tape had dried and the edges of the paper had softened, but the name at the top was still legible. It was not my name. It was someone else's. I had written it in a different version of myself, a younger, angrier man. The kind of man who believed truth was a knife and silence a punishment. I kept that letter not because I planned to deliver it, but because I wanted to remember that there had been a time I had almost said too much. It stayed with me like a secret I wasn't sure I regretted. That morning, I stood in the hallway in front of the coat, my hand hovering over the collar. The sun was barely up, but I could hear the distant hum of tires on wet asphalt. I lived close enough to the interstate to know what kind of weather the world was waking up to. I touched the coat gently, the way a man might touch the gravestone of someone he hadn't forgiven. I turned and walked into the kitchen. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. My coffee pot, one of those old drip machines with a glass carafe, let out a faint gurgle as it worked. I kept the house like a museum. The cabinets still had labels on the inside shelves from when Helen organized everything alphabetically. Flour, garlic powder, honey. The G and the H were next to each other, though they shouldn't have been. But I never changed it. It was wrong in the right way. As I sat at the table and stared at the empty chair across from me, I felt the tug of the coat again. Not the fabric, but the story inside it. The letter, the weight. Not just wool, but memory. Not just lining, but the architecture of a life paused mid-sentence. I had meant to destroy it once. Then I meant to give it away. Then I just let it live there, hidden, like a second skin I didn't wear, but couldn't throw out. My daughter had told me once that I should donate it. "There are men out there who need a coat more than you need nostalgia," she said. She wasn't wrong, but she didn't know what was inside it. Not just the paper, the thoughts, the regrets, the brittle rage of a man who had watched something quietly rot from the inside. A man who, instead of speaking, chose to stitch his truth shut. The clock on the wall ticked in steady rhythm. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting it burn my tongue a little. I didn't mind. Pain was just another way of knowing I was still in the room. Outside, a branch scraped across the window pane. The wind had picked up. I looked at the coat again, still hanging where it always did, still heavy with years. It was more than clothing. It was a boundary, a vessel, a confession with no ears to hear it. That coat had been laughed at, ignored, dismissed, but it had teeth, not the kind that bit, but the kind that waited. I remembered once, a long time ago, when my daughter's husband, my son-in-law, had laughed at it. He had come over for Thanksgiving, wearing some tailored wool thing that probably cost more than my entire closet, and when I opened the door in my old coat, he had smiled a little too wide. The kind of smile that pretends to be polite, but can't hide the edge underneath. He had asked me if I wanted him to take it to Goodwill for me. I said nothing. That was the kind of man I was, even then. I let people say things, and I kept mine in pockets and ink and silence. Now he was a regular in this house, helping my daughter with errands, talking about renovations, glancing at the property lines with thoughts he thought I didn't see. But the coat never moved, and the letter never faded. And I was still here, sitting, brewing coffee, watching the wind. I didn't know why I hadn't burned the letter. Maybe I thought time would make it less sharp. Maybe I hoped it would be forgotten entirely. But part of me knew that some things refuse to die quietly. Some things, like coats and words and the space between men, only get heavier with time. I finished my coffee. The sun had climbed a little higher now, the pale light filtering through the window lace Helen had sewn years ago. The refrigerator clicked off. Silence filled the kitchen, like fog. I stood slowly, knees stiff, and walked back to the hallway. I touched the coat again. The fabric was cold. The letter inside shifted slightly under my fingers. It didn't speak, but it waited. The house sat at the very end of County Line Road, where the pavement cracked into gravel and the gravel turned to dirt and weeds. I had chosen that spot for peace, back when I believed in the kind of silence that came from distance. When Helen and I moved in, there were only 3 other homes within shouting range, and the neighbors were the kind who liked their quiet just as much as we did. The land behind us sloped down to a half-dead orchard, and beyond that was a drainage creek that only flowed in spring. Sometimes, when I looked out past the porch railing, it felt like the whole world had fallen away, and I was the last one standing. The siding of the house had begun to peel in places, and the gutters sagged like tired arms. One of the porch steps had given out last winter, and I had patched it with a cinder block and a sheet of plywood. I didn't mind the decay. It matched the way I moved, slowly, deliberately, with an understanding that things fall apart, and that's no reason to stop walking. Inside, the house was colder than it should have been. Not broken, just old. The furnace had to be coaxed with a soft thump on the side every now and then. The walls were full of photographs, not new ones, just the kind that had yellowed slightly in their frames. Helen, laughing with a sun hat by Lake Erie. My daughter as a baby, wrapped in a blue quilt Helen had made from my old shirts. A dog we had in '94. His name was Murphy, and I still sometimes thought I heard his tags jingling down the hall at night, though he'd been gone almost 2 decades. The living room still had her touch. Crocheted blankets folded on the recliner, a ceramic angel on the windowsill, a vase of dried lavender that hadn't held scent in years. I didn't move any of it. Even dust was part of the story now. Even silence had weight. The kitchen was narrow and dark, with cabinets I had refinished once in the early 90s. My hands still remembered the feel of sanding them down and staining them with the windows open, and a radio playing some ball game I had already forgotten. The handles were brass, tarnished now, but solid. The stove leaned slightly to the left, and the back burner didn't heat evenly. I never fixed it. I had learned to cook around it, the way you learn to live around old injuries. My bedroom faced the backyard. The curtains hadn't been changed since Helen passed. The bed had 1 pillow on each side, but only one ever got used. Her side still had the floral print case, slightly faded. I hadn't washed it. I told myself it was because I didn't sleep on that side, but the truth was simpler. I didn't want to lose the last trace of her. Maybe it was long gone already. Maybe it lived only in memory. But the fabric still held her shape in my mind, and I wasn't ready to fold that away. I had grown used to being alone in the house, but not invisible. There was a difference. After Helen's funeral, my daughter had started coming around more often. At first, it was comforting. She brought casseroles and made polite small talk, adjusted the thermostat like she was still 8 and trying to help her parents feel modern. But then she brought him, her husband. The first time he came, he wore polished shoes and a coat that looked like it came with its own valet. He smiled wide, like he was inspecting something he planned to fix. I had met him before, of course, at the wedding, at birthdays, at gatherings where we nodded at each other across rooms. But now he was in my house. Now he looked at the floorboards like they offended him. He commented on the slope of the kitchen, the creak in the hallway, the fact that I didn't have a microwave. I told him I didn't need one. He looked amused, said nothing, just let the silence stretch, like he was drawing lines between everything he thought was wrong and everything he thought I couldn't afford to change. They started coming regularly. He would talk about property values and taxes and how far the nearest hospital was. My daughter nodded a lot. She said things like, "Just thinking ahead," and "You never know." But I could hear the undertones. I could see how his eyes wandered to the old photographs, the piles of mail on the table, the coat by the door. He always looked at that coat. He asked once if I had considered downsizing. I asked him if he had considered shutting up. Not aloud, just in my head. Out loud, I smiled and offered him tea I knew he wouldn't drink. The house didn't bother me. The loneliness didn't scare me. But the way he watched, that bothered me. Like he was measuring the space for his own shadow. Like he saw my life as a shelf he could dust off and repurpose. One afternoon, I watched him from the porch as he walked the perimeter of my yard. He squinted at the fencing, crouched near the old shed, pointed at the water meter like it was a relic. My daughter followed him with a clipboard. They didn't think I noticed, but the house noticed. The porch boards groaned a little louder under my weight. The wind curled through the eaves like a whisper of warning. Later that night, I stood in the hallway and looked at my coat. I pressed my hand against the inside where the letter lay. I hadn't touched it in years, but something about his presence, about the way he moved through my space like he already owned it, made my fingers itch. The paper inside hadn't moved, but I had. I went to the kitchen and sat in the dark. The hum of the fridge was louder at night. I thought about the foundation of the house, how I had poured part of it myself with borrowed tools and aching arms. I thought about the nails I had hammered, the wallpaper Helen had chosen, the hours spent fixing what didn't work. And I thought about how none of that seemed to matter to him. To him, it was just an old house with uneven floors and too many trees. To him, I was just a man with a coat that should have been thrown out years ago. But he didn't know what lived inside the walls. He didn't know what slept behind the door, or what waited between the seams of the lining. He didn't know the house had teeth, and neither did he know how long I could sit in the dark, waiting, without blinking. Thanksgiving had always been Helen's favorite holiday. She liked the rhythm of it, the peeling, the seasoning, the smells building through the day, like a slow crescendo. Even after our daughter moved out, Helen insisted on making the full spread. For tradition, she used to say. That word meant something to her. To me, too. At least it used to. After Helen passed, the tradition didn't die all at once. It frayed, piece by piece, like a blanket unraveling at the corner. The first year, my daughter hosted at her place. The second, they suggested a restaurant, some loud modern place with granite countertops and waiters who called everyone guys. I hated it. I didn't say anything. I never did. But I left early, claiming I was tired, and drove the long way home in silence. The third year, they brought Thanksgiving to my house again. Or so they said. It wasn't for me. I knew that. It was convenience. They didn't want to drive far. They said I needed company. Maybe I did. But what I needed more was a place that still felt like it belonged to me. That morning, I had woken early. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the steam curl upward like breath from an old wound. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but already I could feel the weight of the day ahead pressing on my chest. I didn't cook. They told me not to. My daughter said it was taken care of. That phrase always sounded like a lock clicking into place. They arrived around 11. My daughter carried plastic bags full of food from a catering service. Her husband trailed behind her, holding a bottle of wine and scanning the living room like he was appraising the furniture. He nodded at me, then looked away, before I could return the gesture. I watched them unload trays onto my counter, rearranging my kitchen as if it were a hotel suite. I sat in my chair at the head of the table, the same chair I had used every holiday since Helen first set it for me back in '83. No one said anything about it, but my daughter placed a different chair at the end and sat me beside it instead. She said something cheerful about mixing it up. I didn't argue. I moved, but the legs of the chair dragged louder than they should have, like the wood itself resented being moved. They filled the table with food I didn't recognize. Quinoa salad, something with cranberries and goat cheese, mashed potatoes that came in plastic containers. It all looked neat and tasteless. I missed the smell of Helen's stuffing, the slight char on the sweet potatoes, the gravy with too much pepper. I missed the clutter, the noise, the burnt rolls she always claimed were just how Dad liked them. As we sat down, I noticed how the table had changed. There were new placemats, some geometric pattern that didn't match the wallpaper. The silverware had been replaced. My daughter must have brought them from her house. Even the salt and pepper shakers were different. Little ceramic foxes, grinning with blank expressions. Helen's glass swans were nowhere to be seen. He sat directly across from me. My son-in-law, elbows on the table, back straight, fork spinning slowly in his hand. He was the kind of man who always looked like he was thinking something slightly clever, slightly cruel. He wore a sweater with elbow patches and spoke like a man explaining things to children. Everything he said came out with a tone of gentle condescension. As the meal unfolded, he started talking. He always did. About the market, about real estate, about a new consulting firm he was advising. My daughter nodded along, eyes wide, lips tight. She had learned how to live in his rhythm. I had not. I didn't belong to that tempo. At one point, he gestured around the room and said something about untapped potential. He was talking about the house. My house. He spoke of open concept opportunities and smart renovations as if the walls had ears and the floorboards had signed a surrender. He wasn't asking for my opinion. He wasn't even addressing me. He was performing, like an actor on a stage he thought he owned. I cut into a slice of turkey. The knife squeaked against the plate. My hearing wasn't what it used to be, but I caught the word update more than once. I also caught the way he looked at the coat by the door, hanging exactly where it always did. His mouth twisted slightly, like the sight of it offended him. I wondered if he had hoped I would replace it. I hadn't. He made a joke about old habits, and everyone laughed. I didn't. I didn't even look up, but I felt the heat rise in my ears. I stared at the pattern in the tablecloth, counting the stitched diamonds like they could anchor me. That's when it struck me. I wasn't part of the table anymore. I was an ornament, something to glance at, include out of obligation, then forget once the dishes were cleared. I had become background. I thought about the letter. Not the content, not yet, just the existence of it. The feel of it under my hand when I wore the coat. The weight of it pressed against my chest, even through fabric and time. I thought about how it had survived every purge, every season, every attempt at reinvention. I had kept it because I wasn't ready to release it. Now I realized, maybe I had kept it because some part of me always knew this day would come. The table buzzed with conversation that circled around me like wind around a rock. I heard numbers, laughed at news headlines, predictions for the next election. They toasted to new beginnings and growth. I sipped my water. It tasted like plastic. When dessert came, it wasn't pie. It was something pale and gelatinous in a dish that looked like it belonged at a baby shower. My daughter said it was healthier. I watched her husband nod in approval and reach for a second serving. I couldn't taste anything anymore. The food filled space, but it didn't speak to me. After they left, I cleared the plates alone. I didn't ask them to help. I didn't want help. The sink filled with lukewarm water and the smell of soap. I scrubbed slowly, listening to the clink of forks and the whisper of sponge against porcelain. The Swan salt shaker was still gone. I didn't ask about it. I dried my hands, went to the hallway, and stood before the coat. I ran my fingers along the seams, stopping at the soft bulge in the lining. The letter hadn't moved, but I had. At that table, I had vanished. But here, in the shadow of my own doorway, I still existed. I still carried something they didn't understand, and maybe that was enough. For now. The first frost came that week. I noticed it early in the morning, a pale crust over the windowsill and the hood of the truck I no longer drove. The grass in the front yard looked like it had been dusted with sugar, and the bare limbs of the oak trees scratched lightly at the gray sky. I had lived through enough winters to feel the change before I saw it. The way the air shifted in the corners of the house, the sudden bite in the pipes, the ache that moved deeper into my joints. I stood by the front door, debating whether or not to wear the coat. I didn't need it for warmth that day. It wasn't the cold that moved me, but something else, a pull I couldn't name. I reached for it like I had done thousands of times before, letting my fingers graze the rough wool and the softened edge of the collar. It creaked when I slipped my arm through the sleeve, the fabric stiff from age, but still mine. I fastened the top button and stood there for a moment, adjusting the way it hung on my shoulders. The weight of it grounded me, made the world feel more solid beneath my feet. I was expecting them shortly. My daughter had called earlier that week to say they were dropping by to check in, a phrase I'd come to associate with quiet assessments of my health, my habits, the state of the house, and though they never said it aloud, my remaining usefulness. I had offered to prepare lunch, but she insisted they'd bring something. She always did, as if my kitchen was some relic to be tolerated, not used. I waited in the entryway, watching the frost slowly melt from the walkway. The birds had gone quiet. Even the breeze felt reluctant, like the day itself was holding its breath. When their car pulled into the gravel, I saw it before I heard it. Sleek, dark, with glass so tinted I couldn't see inside. It didn't belong in my driveway. It didn't belong next to the pickup that hadn't moved in 2 years, or the cracked stepping stones Helen had laid herself back in '89. But it rolled up, like it had every right. He got out first. My son-in-law, jacket too clean, hair too sculpted, sunglasses still on even in the overcast light. He walked up the path like it was a runway, each step confident, measured. My daughter followed, arms full of grocery bags that looked more decorative than practical. He didn't carry anything. He never did. I opened the door before they knocked. I didn't want the sound of his knuckles against the wood. I didn't want to hear my own door echo with something that felt too much like intrusion. He looked at me, then at the coat. His expression shifted, just a flicker, but I caught it. Disbelief, maybe. Amusement. Disdain. It was the same look he gave when I once poured milk from a glass bottle instead of a carton. The same smirk when I told him I used cash for most things. "Still got the old coat, huh?" he said. I didn't answer. I stepped aside to let them in. He brushed past me with that exaggerated air of someone being polite, someone pretending not to wrinkle his nose. My daughter gave me a kiss on the cheek and stepped in quietly, placing the bags on the kitchen table. He turned in the hallway, eyes still on the coat. Then he laughed. Not a burst, but a sharp exhale, the kind people make when they want to pretend it's all in good humor, but their shoulders give them away. "That thing's practically vintage," he said to no one in particular. "Should donate it to a museum." He laughed again. It hit different this time. Maybe it was the tone, or the timing, or just the way he stood in my house like he was already measuring curtains in his head. The laugh lingered in the doorway, like smoke from something that had burned too long. I didn't laugh. I didn't say anything. I let him have the moment, because I knew something he didn't. That coat, with all its wear and memory, carried more than he ever would. I didn't need him to know that. Not yet. He stepped into the kitchen like he owned it, opening a cabinet and commenting on the old mugs. My daughter busied herself unwrapping store-bought sandwiches and gluten-free crackers, setting them out, like offerings. I stood in the hall a moment longer, letting my hand rest along the edge of the coat. The letter was still there, nestled inside the inner lining, folded tight, untouched. I thought about how long it had been since I'd written it, how certain I had been that it might never be read, how I had almost thrown it out, burned it, torn it to pieces. But something stopped me every time. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the quiet hope that one day it would serve its purpose, not in rage, but in truth. We ate in the kitchen, the three of us. He dominated the conversation as usual, talking about market shifts and tax strategies and how remote work was changing the landscape. I nodded when it felt necessary. My daughter smiled too much and spoke too little. I wondered how often she heard that same voice in her sleep. At some point, he looked at the coat again. It was hanging on the back of the door now, slouched under its own age, sleeves slightly twisted. He said something about how men of his generation dressed with more care, how appearance still meant something, how if he ever had a father like me, he'd upgrade him by force. The joke sat there, heavy and awkward. I didn't move. I kept chewing. I let him think he was funny. I let him think he was clever. Because I understood something he never would. The loudest man in the room is always the one with the most to hide. After they left, I walked to the door and took the coat back into my arms. I held it there a moment, pressing my hand against the inner seam. The letter crinkled faintly under my fingers. I could still hear his laugh in the air, but it no longer sounded like victory. It sounded like a countdown. I didn't take the coat off right away. After they left that afternoon, I stood in the hallway a long time, leaning against the door they'd closed behind them. The echo of his laughter hadn't entirely faded from the wood. It clung to the air like a smell, faint but sour. I pressed the deadbolt into place with my thumb and rested my forehead against the cool frame for a few seconds longer, just breathing. The coat felt heavier than usual, not just from age or wool or the years of road salt and grease embedded in its lining, but from something more silent. The kind of weight that didn't come from outside things, but from memories tucked out of sight. I walked slowly to the bedroom and lowered myself into the chair beside the window, still wearing it. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't need to see the walls to know what they'd say. It had been almost 2 decades since I slipped the letter into the coat. That morning had been clear and cold. I remember the light especially, brittle sunlight that came in through the kitchen window and made the dust on the counter look like smoke. I had written the letter with a black pen that skipped when I wrote too fast. I didn't write it out of anger, though the anger was there. I wrote it because I couldn't say it aloud, and I feared that if I waited, the truth would rot inside me. That truth needed to live somewhere. So I gave it a home. The coat had hung on a nail near the back door. I remember folding the letter carefully, the way I used to fold Helen's notes when she left them in my lunch pail. I wrapped it in a plastic sandwich bag, sealed it with tape, and slit the inner lining of the coat with a box cutter. Just a few inches. Just enough to slip the envelope inside, then stitch it closed again with black thread and trembling fingers. There had been no ceremony, no witnesses, just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of a neighbor's dog barking in the distance. But I remember my hands shaking. I remember the taste of metal in my mouth. I remember thinking, this will stay hidden until it's needed, until someone pushes too far. And then I forgot it, or tried to. I wore the coat on cold mornings and long drives, on walks around the block, on visits to the hardware store. The letter moved with me. It warmed against my chest when I stepped outside. It shifted gently with the rhythm of my arms. It became part of the coat, part of me. But I never took it out. I never reread what I wrote. I never dared. Now I leaned forward in the chair, pulled the lapel closer to my chin, and let my fingers slide under the fabric. I knew exactly where to press. The slight give, the faint crackle of plastic, the memory made physical. My fingers hovered over the hidden edge. I thought about opening it, just to feel the paper again, just to remember how certain I had once been. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there for a long time, staring out the window, watching nothing in particular. A branch tapping the glass, a squirrel darting through the fence. The world carried on, ignorant of the little wars we fought in quiet rooms. The letter wasn't a confession. It wasn't a threat. It was something in between. I had written it to him, my son-in-law, before he became what he is now, before the small slights, the glances, the slow erosion of respect, before the smirk, before the laugh. Back then, he had only just married my daughter. I didn't know him, but something in his eyes unsettled me, something behind the charm, behind the ambition, behind the polished shoes. He spoke too smoothly. He held my daughter's arm a little too tight. He had a way of scanning a room like he was counting assets. I watched quietly, and I wrote the letter not because of what he'd done, but because of what I knew he could do. In that letter, I wrote what I had witnessed, something from years earlier, something he thought no one had seen. It had happened outside a bar in Columbus. I had been there for a delivery. He didn't see me. He wasn't with my daughter. He wasn't sober, and the woman he pulled into his car wasn't either. I stood on the other side of the lot, leaning against my rig, hidden by the angle. I didn't take pictures. I didn't intervene. I just watched. And later that night, I sat in my cab and wrote down every detail I remembered. The time, the license plate, the bruises I saw on her wrist as she tried to laugh them off. I didn't confront him. I didn't tell my daughter. I didn't go to the police. Maybe I should have. I don't know. I was a different man then. Tired, confused, newly retired, grieving Helen's diagnosis. I didn't trust my instincts, but I trusted paper. I trusted the permanence of ink. So I put it all into the letter. I didn't sign it. I didn't title it. I just folded it, sealed it, and sewed it into a coat I couldn't part with. And now, all these years later, he laughed at that coat, like it was worthless, like it belonged to a man who no longer mattered. He didn't know the coat remembered him better than I ever wanted to. I stood up and walked to the mirror in the hallway. The overhead light flickered slightly when I turned it on. I looked at myself, coat buttoned to the collar, shoulders slightly slumped, eyes set deep in folds of time. I touched the lining once more. The letter hadn't moved, but something in me had. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the way my daughter looked at me now, more like a patient than a parent. Maybe it was the way he walked through my house, leaving the scent of ownership in every room. Maybe it was just the cold, sinking in deeper than it should. But for the first time in years, I didn't want to keep the letter hidden forever. I didn't want it to be a relic. I wanted it to be seen. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. I walked back to the living room, turned off the light, and sank into the chair once more. The coat stayed on. The letter stayed where it was. But the quiet around me shifted, as if the house had overheard my thoughts, and was waiting too. It started with footsteps, not loud ones, not heavy, but different, deliberate, too confident for a guest, too comfortable for someone who didn't belong. They came with regularity now, not just on holidays or birthdays. He came with her, my daughter, more often than she used to come alone, and it was clear he no longer waited to be invited. They would show up with a knock, but not the kind of knock that asked permission. It was the knock of formality, just long enough to say, "We gave you notice," but short enough to remind me that they had keys. My daughter had taken one years ago, in case of emergency. I remembered giving it to her. I didn't remember giving one to him. He never asked if he could walk through the rooms. He just did. He moved through my home like it was a property listing, glancing at fixtures, running fingers along the window frames, opening drawers that had nothing to do with him. He commented on things while doing it, offhandedly, half to himself, as if thinking aloud. This could be torn down. This wall's probably not load-bearing. Could open this whole space up. He said these things with the tone of someone who wasn't dreaming. He was planning. The first time he went into Helen's sewing room, I didn't notice right away. The door had been shut since the funeral. She'd kept it just the way she liked. Spools of thread lined up in an old wooden case, fabric folded into neat towers, a sewing machine on a table by the window, facing east for the morning light. That room had always been hers, and after she was gone, it became a kind of museum. Not a place I went often, but a place I respected. I found the door open one morning after they left. The light was different. The curtains had been pushed aside, and a few of the spools were out of order. A measuring tape had been left across the back of the chair. He had been in there. I knew it. My daughter wouldn't have touched anything. She understood what that room meant. He didn't. The next time, it was the attic. I heard the stairs creak in the afternoon and looked up to see the panel in the hallway ceiling slightly ajar. When I asked my daughter, carefully, gently, she said he had been looking for insulation issues. "Just helping out," she said. I nodded, but my hands curled tightly around the arms of the chair. I didn't like the way his footsteps sounded upstairs. They were slower, firmer, the way someone walks through a space they intend to claim. I could hear him opening boxes, shifting things. The attic held decades of life, and he didn't ask before walking through it like a catalog. At night, the house felt different, not just quieter, but watched. I couldn't explain it. There was nothing in the corners, no cameras, no evidence. But still, I sat in my chair and listened to the creaks and groans of the old structure, and it felt less like the house was speaking to me, and more like it was being listened to by something else. He began offering advice in his usual voice, half helpful, half conquering. "You could rent this place out, you know. Plenty of people your age prefer assisted living these days. The equity alone could carry you through your final years." Final years. That's what he said, with a straight face, as if the story of my life had a calendar and he had already penciled in the ending. I said little. I watched his hands as he gestured to the walls, to the ceiling, to the floor. He spoke like a man who saw value only in square footage and modern plumbing. He never mentioned the garden Helen had planted with her own fingers. He never looked at the pictures on the mantel that tracked our life in faded color. He didn't hear the stairs creak in the middle, the exact way they always had, like an old friend clearing its throat. Once he stood in the kitchen, looking around like he was measuring it in his mind. He said it was time to update the bones of the house. I almost laughed. He didn't know the bones. He didn't know the sound of Helen's laugh from that exact corner by the fridge. He didn't know the rhythm of my steps in the hallway, or the late-night creak of the floorboard near the sink. Bones weren't something you updated. They were something you respected. He didn't understand the difference. One evening, they arrived while I was in the shed out back. When I came in, I found him in the living room, sitting in my chair, the one I had sat in every morning and every evening for years. The indentation of my body was still fresh in the cushion. He didn't get up when I walked in. He looked at me, smiled, and nodded like he was letting me know the chair was comfortable. I didn't say anything. I walked past him, into the kitchen, and stood with my back to the room until he got up on his own. That night, I walked the house alone, room by room. I touched the doorknobs, the window frames, the wallpaper seam in the hallway Helen had glued back into place with a popsicle stick and a spoon. I stood in the kitchen and ran my fingers across the grooves in the counter where she had kneaded dough. I climbed the stairs slowly and checked the attic door. It was closed again, but I could still smell the dust of things disturbed. In the bedroom, I opened the closet and took out the coat. I slipped it on and sat on the edge of the bed. The weight settled on my shoulders. I pressed my hand gently against the inner seam. The letter was still there, untouched, unread, but suddenly closer to the surface than ever before. His footsteps hadn't just crossed wood, they had crossed memory, privacy, lineage. He was tracing a map in my home with the intent to redraw the borders, and I knew, not in panic, but in certainty, that the letter would not remain buried forever. He had made his way into the rooms. I was going to remind him what they held. It had been years since I went to the county fair. The last time Helen and I had walked the grounds together, stopping at every booth like we were seeing it all for the first time. We bought kettle corn in a paper bag and stood shoulder to shoulder watching school kids parade sheep in the livestock ring. That year she wore her old denim jacket, the one with the faded collar and the rip in the sleeve. I remember thinking how good she looked with the wind in her hair, how young she still felt to me, despite the gray. I hadn't returned since she died. But this year, something pulled me toward it. Maybe it was the weather, bright and crisp, the kind of day that coaxed you outside no matter what you were carrying inside. Maybe it was the silence of the house that morning, how every clock tick seemed louder than usual. Or maybe it was the coat hanging by the door, the letter inside pressing against me even when I wasn't wearing it. It was time to move, to be among people, to remember the rhythm of life outside the confines of memory. I put on the coat, I didn't think twice about it. It was cold enough to justify it. But even if it hadn't been, I still would have worn it. It was part of me now, as much as the hands that buttoned it or the shoulders it rested on. As I walked down the gravel path to my truck, I slipped my hand inside, not into the pockets, but along the inner seam, just to feel the bump of the hidden letter. It was still there, nestled deep, secure. It always would be, until I decided otherwise. The fairgrounds hadn't changed much. They never did. The same chain-link fence lined the perimeter. The same red and white striped tents rose in neat rows along the main walkway. Children darted between legs with cotton candy in one hand and plastic prizes in the other. The smell of fried dough and engine grease filled the air like a second atmosphere. Somewhere in the distance, a cover band played something too loud through cheap speakers, and every once in a while, the hum of laughter or the screech of a ride rose above the crowd like a burst of static. I walked slowly, letting the noise wash over me. I kept to the edge, near the fencing, where I could move without bumping into anyone. I stopped at a booth selling old postcards. Sepia-toned scenes of Ohio in winter. Black and white shots of the riverfront back when it still had working barges. I picked one up that reminded me of a trip Helen and I had taken to Marietta. I put it down without buying it. As I turned away, I saw him. He was standing near the food trucks, holding a soda and talking to a man I didn't recognize. My daughter wasn't with him. He was alone, in his weekend clothes, jeans too new, jacket too tight, sunglasses on even though the sun was starting to sink. His laugh was unmistakable. It carried like a crow's call across a quiet field. I didn't expect to see him there. This wasn't his world. He wasn't the type for funnel cakes and homemade crafts. But there he was, gesturing as he spoke, looking around like he owned the place. I watched from a distance, unsure whether to turn away or stand my ground. Then he saw me. He looked directly at me and smiled. A tight smile, the kind you offer when you don't expect to be seen, but don't want to show it rattled you. His eyes dropped to the coat. The expression shifted. It was quick, almost invisible, but I caught it. Recognition, irritation, maybe even discomfort. And then he laughed. It was soft, but deliberate. He tilted his head, mouthed something I didn't hear, and turned back to his conversation. He didn't wave. He didn't approach. He dismissed me with that one laugh and turned away, like I was another outdated booth he had no interest in visiting. I stood there a moment longer, not out of shock, not even out of anger, but because something inside me had settled. Not broken, settled. Like dust after a door slams shut. I walked past him, not fast, not slow, just steady. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. His voice faded behind me, blending into the chaos of the crowd. I walked toward the livestock pavilion, where children were brushing goats and laughing over who got the better ribbon. I stood near the edge and watched for a long time, letting their joy become something I could breathe. As the sun dropped lower and the air turned sharper, I began making my way back through the fair. The crowd had thinned slightly, replaced by the evening families, young parents carrying toddlers, teens in matching hoodies. I moved quietly, unseen. That was fine by me. Back at the truck, I paused before opening the door. I slipped my hand once more along the lining of the coat. The letter was there, warm from my body. I thought of him, of his laugh, of his glance, of how quick he was to discard anything he didn't understand. He didn't know what the coat carried. He didn't know that the laugh he offered so freely would one day cost him more than he was willing to pay. As I drove home, the sky turned from pale gold to deep gray. The road was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into your bones and rearranges something. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't need noise. I had his voice already, and I had the answer, tucked inside the coat. Waiting. The house was colder that night, not by temperature alone, but by presence. A kind of stillness had settled in, not peace, but vacancy. The kind that follows an invisible line of thought that's been pushed too long into the corner of the mind. I locked the front door, turned off the porch light, and stood in the entryway for a moment without moving, the key still in my hand, the coat still on my back. The seams of the sleeves rubbed quietly against themselves as I exhaled. I didn't take the coat off. I kept it on like a second skin, warm with the day's tension, pressed close to the breath of memory and meaning. I walked through the dark house without turning on the lights. My feet knew the floorboards. My fingers knew the walls. I could count the steps between rooms in my sleep, and often did. The house groaned faintly under my weight, as if it too was aware of the turning point that hovered in the air, like dust above a closed book. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table without drinking it. The moonlight through the curtain fell in a crooked line across the old linoleum, and the refrigerator hummed a quiet counterpoint to the thud of my own pulse. The coat pressed against my ribs as I leaned forward, my elbows on the table, my hands folded in front of me like a man about to pray. But prayer had left me a long time ago. I sat there a long time, staring at the glass. It caught the moonlight in a soft shimmer, a ghost of fire in still water. My reflection shimmered faintly in the curve of the rim. I looked tired. More than tired. The kind of fatigue that burrows into your name and stays there. I reached into the coat, not for the outer pocket, but the lining. The hidden place. The place I had sealed like a tomb 20 years earlier. My fingers found the edge, soft, familiar, curved around the folded plastic. I didn't pull it out. I just touched it. Let my fingers trace the lines of the letter's body, as if reacquainting myself with an old friend I no longer trusted. The letter hadn't changed. I had. Something had cracked open at the fair. Not a rupture, not a breakdown, just a clean, decisive shift in the way I saw things. His laugh, his face, the dismissal in his glance, all of it folded neatly into a confirmation I had avoided for years. There was no misunderstanding anymore, no room for maybe, no doubt about what needed to happen. I stood up and moved through the hallway. The photographs on the wall watched me as I passed. Helen's smile in every frame seemed to follow me like a benediction I didn't deserve. I paused once, in front of the picture from our 25th anniversary. She wore blue that night, and the way she held my arm looked permanent. I remembered how tightly she'd gripped my fingers in the restaurant bathroom when she told me something about him didn't sit right. That was the first time she had said it aloud. I hadn't forgotten. In the bedroom, I turned on the lamp beside the bed. The room bloomed into soft gold. The blanket was still turned down on her side. I hadn't touched it in years. My own side was worn with the imprint of restless nights and long thoughts. I sat on the edge of the bed and removed the coat, slowly, carefully, like it was made of something more than wool and memory. I laid it across my lap and turned it inside out. I found the seam quickly, a crooked line of hand stitching, black thread against gray silk. I had sewn it myself, though I could barely remember doing it. The stitches held, firm and crude. I ran my finger along the seam, then stood, walked to the closet, and pulled down the wooden box from the top shelf. Inside was my old sewing kit. I hadn't opened it in over a decade. I sat again. My hands trembled slightly, but not from weakness, from purpose. I found the scissors, not sharp anymore, but enough. I cut the seam open with the kind of precision that only comes from years of silent intention. The letter slid into my palm, like a breath. It was lighter than I remembered. Yellowed at the corners, the plastic wrapping cracked with age. I peeled it open slowly, feeling the stick of old tape give way. The paper inside was still legible. The ink hadn't faded much. My handwriting stared back at me, angrier than I remembered, straighter, more certain. I had written it in one sitting, no edits, no crossings out, just a long, brutal spill of truth. I read it, every word, aloud, though no one else was in the room. When I finished, I folded it again, not the way it had been before, tighter, smaller, sharper. I didn't put it back into the coat. I placed it on the nightstand, under the base of the lamp, not hidden, not flaunted, just there, visible. I stood and looked around the room. Nothing had changed, but everything had. The silence felt different. It no longer pressed in from all sides. It breathed. The walls held me upright, not in pity, but in understanding. In the hallway, I turned off the lights, one by one. Kitchen, bedroom, living room. The house settled into darkness like an old dog curling into sleep. I walked back to the front door, looked out at the porch, at the black outline of the trees, at the faint shimmer of frost beginning to collect again on the railing. I didn't lock the door this time, not out of forgetfulness, but by choice. I left the coat on the chair, and the letter out in the open. Tomorrow would come, and when it did, I would no longer be quiet. I woke before the sun, though I hadn't slept much. The hours of the night had passed not in rest, but in stillness, the kind of heavy silence where your mind doesn't race, but walks, slow and deliberate, through corridors of memory. My body felt stiff when I sat up, like the house itself had held me in place. The letter remained on the nightstand, where I had left it the night before, its folded corners lit by the dim blue of early morning. I stared at it for a long time before reaching for it. The paper felt thinner now, more fragile, and yet somehow heavier in the hand, like it had absorbed all the years it had waited. I didn't need to read it again. The words were carved in me now, as if I'd swallowed them whole the night before, and they had settled into my chest. I didn't bother with breakfast. I brewed coffee out of habit, but the cup went cold on the kitchen table. I dressed slowly, taking time with each button, each fold, like I was preparing for a ritual. The coat came last. I hadn't sewn the lining shut again. I didn't need to. I slipped the letter inside the front pocket, not the hidden one this time, but the outer one, plain, accessible, intentional. I knew they were coming. My daughter had texted me the day before, saying they wanted to stop by to check in. Those were her words. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She'd come anyway. She always did, especially when he told her to. By late morning, I heard the tires on gravel. The sound was different now, familiar but unwelcome, like an old dog that bites. I stood by the window but didn't move the curtain. I watched the car pull up, watched the doors open, watched him get out first, as always. He wore a pressed jacket, casual but expensive, the kind you wear to impress people who don't know better. My daughter followed, carrying something in her hands, a tray of food, maybe. Something polite, something that said we're just visiting. I opened the door before they knocked. I didn't greet them. I simply stepped back and let them enter, the way one opens a door for a storm. He crossed the threshold like it was a stage. She gave me a small smile and moved toward the kitchen. He lingered in the hallway, looking around, letting his eyes do what his words usually did. We sat in the living room, the three of us. He took the larger chair, mine, without hesitation. My daughter sat on the edge of the couch, her knees close together, her hands folded in her lap. I remained standing for a moment before settling into the smaller chair by the window. The coat was still on me. The letter was still in the pocket. He started talking about the roof, about the pipes, about how the back steps were a hazard and how the foundation might need attention. My daughter added soft commentary, as if cushioning his words in kindness. I watched them both. I nodded once or twice, I let them say what they came to say. Then I reached into my pocket. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled out the letter and placed it on the coffee table between us. The paper looked out of place, yellowed and worn against the clean lines of the furniture, like something left behind in a place that no longer remembered it. He looked at it. At first, he didn't react. He continued speaking, his voice steady, though I noticed the pause between syllables lengthen. His eyes kept drifting toward the letter. My daughter noticed it too, glancing down and then quickly away. I didn't speak. I didn't push it toward him. I didn't gesture or explain. I simply let it sit there, like a stone dropped into a still pond, and waited. He reached for it eventually. His hand hovered a moment above the paper, as if the weight of the decision had changed. Then his fingers closed around it, and he lifted it carefully, as though unsure of what might be inside. He didn't open it. Not yet. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, his expression shifted. The confidence flickered. The posture changed. He wasn't leaning forward anymore. He wasn't in control of the conversation. The silence between us pressed into the room like a fourth presence, louder than any accusation. My daughter watched him. Then she looked at me. Her face was pale, her eyes confused. She opened her mouth slightly, as if to ask what it was, but no sound came. She looked back at him. He still hadn't opened the letter. I stood up. The room felt colder now, though the heat was still on. I stepped toward the hallway, slowly, my footsteps soft against the wood floor. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I had said everything already, years ago, in ink. What remained was only theirs to face. I left them in the living room and walked down the hallway to the back of the house. I passed the photos again, the hallway light casting long shadows across the faces of time. I paused once, near the kitchen, and looked through the window over the sink. The yard was bare, the trees skeletal, the garden beds empty. But it was still mine. Every nail, every crack, every layer of dust. Behind me, I didn't hear voices, only the quiet rustle of paper, the slow sound of breath held too long, the moment before the fall. I walked into the bedroom and closed the door behind me. Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere in the house, silence finally did what it always does. It made them listen. I stayed in the bedroom for a long while after I closed the door, not to hide, not to eavesdrop, but because I didn't want to interfere with the silence I had left behind. Some truths don't need a witness. Some moments should unfold without interruption. I sat on the edge of the bed, the same place where I had read the letter aloud to myself the night before, and I listened to the absence of sound from the other side of the house. At first, there was nothing. No movement, no voices, just stillness. That kind of tense, layered stillness that happens when words hover over people like a storm cloud. I pictured them sitting there, the letter on the table, untouched or maybe already in his hands. I imagined the moment his eyes found his name written on the envelope, the shape of it, the weight of it, his full name, not a nickname, not initials, but his full name in my handwriting, written the way one carves something into stone. I had written it that way, on purpose, because I wanted it to hit hard when he saw it. There was a reason I hadn't signed the letter back when I wrote it. There was a reason I hadn't explained it, or even told anyone it existed. The words didn't need a signature. They only needed a direction, a destination. His name was the key. His name was the lock. I stood eventually. The coat was still on the chair by the bed. The pocket, now empty, sagged slightly with its loss. I picked it up, ran my hand over the front where the letter had rested just hours earlier, and then laid it gently across the foot of the bed. In the hallway, the shadows had shifted. The light from the window near the kitchen had moved across the floor like a slow tide, illuminating the photos in softer angles. I walked past them again. Helen's smile. My daughter as a child. Our wedding day. My old rig. All those moments we thought would last forever, captured in squares and rectangles behind glass. I stopped outside the living room and listened. They were still inside. The air in the hallway held their presence like a held breath. I stepped into the doorway. He sat on the edge of the armchair, the letter open in his hands, not reading, just holding it now. My daughter sat on the couch, pale and rigid, her eyes unfocused. Between them was the coffee table, and on it lay the envelope. Open, empty, faced upward like a mouth. I didn't say anything. I stood there until he looked up at me. His face had changed. It wasn't anger or embarrassment I saw. It was something deeper. Recognition. A man forced to acknowledge a version of himself he had spent years denying. A man who suddenly saw how far back someone had been watching. His hand clenched the paper too tightly. I could hear the faint sound of it crumpling. Then he looked at the envelope again. At his name. It was a moment I'll never forget. The way his eyes traced each letter as if he were seeing his own identity for the first time. Not as a badge, but as a sentence. Not as a possession, but as a verdict. He reached out and turned the envelope over, as though searching for something else. A date, a signature, a loophole. But I had left him none. The words were the proof. The name was the signature. The silence was the seal. My daughter finally looked up. Her eyes were wet, but she hadn't cried. Not yet. Her hands rested in her lap, folded tightly, fingers pressed into each other like she was trying to keep herself from shaking. She didn't ask what the letter was. She didn't have to. Something in her already knew. She looked at the envelope, then at him, then at me. She opened her mouth, but the words never came. She lowered her eyes again, her shoulders curling slightly inward. I saw the years settle into her like dust. I stepped farther into the room and sat in the smaller chair by the window, the one I always used. The coat lay folded across my lap. The room was quiet, but it wasn't empty. The walls held the weight of the letter now. The house remembered what had been said, even if no one spoke it aloud. He sat still, staring at the page, eyes scanning it again and again. The smugness was gone. The casual humor, the small gestures of superiority, gone. What remained was a man confronting the fact that he had never really been unseen, that his past hadn't vanished simply because no one spoke of it, that what we bury doesn't stay buried forever. He looked up once more, met my eyes, and didn't blink. I didn't blink either. I didn't need to speak. The moment spoke for me. He stood slowly, folding the letter with unsteady hands. My daughter watched him but didn't move. He placed the paper back into the envelope, smoothing it down, as though trying to recontain what had already escaped. He set the envelope on the table and stepped back, but he didn't sit down again. For a moment, he looked at me like he might say something, but whatever he was going to say stayed in his throat. He turned toward the hallway instead. My daughter hesitated, then followed him. At the doorway, she paused, looked at me again. Her mouth opened, closed. Then she followed him out. I sat in the quiet that followed, the coat still across my legs, the envelope resting alone on the table. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full, heavy with the truth that had finally come into the light. The name on the envelope wasn't just his. It belonged to the man he had tried not to be, and to the man I had never stopped seeing. And now he knew. The door clicked shut with a softness that felt louder than any slam. I heard the gravel shift under the tires as their car pulled away, that familiar hum fading into the distance, swallowed by the trees and the wind that had picked up since morning. I didn't move from my chair. I sat there, coat still draped over my lap, the envelope on the coffee table like a single piece of driftwood left behind after a storm. The room had never felt that empty before, not even after Helen died. This was a different kind of emptiness, not from absence, but from a release, a hollowing out. Like the air had been scooped from the space and replaced with the weight of what had finally been said without a voice. No one had raised their tone. No one had wept. But the damage had been done, and not in destruction, but in unveiling. I leaned forward and stared at the surface of the table. I could still see the slight indentation from where he had set the envelope down. Just that small pressure on the wood, a mark that would fade, but for now felt as etched as a scar. I traced it with one finger, not to erase it, but to confirm it had been real. That they had been here. That I had handed him the thing I once promised myself would stay hidden forever. The walls creaked faintly. The house, too, felt quieter. Not dead, not abandoned, but observing. I could almost feel it breathe around me, like it had been waiting for this moment longer than I had. I rose slowly, knees protesting the movement, and walked toward the kitchen. The coffee from that morning still sat in the pot, dark and cold. I poured it anyway, reheated it on the stove the way Helen used to, slowly, without rush, without a microwave. The old enamel pan hissed a little as the liquid warmed, and for a moment I imagined the sounds of a normal day. Footsteps in slippers, dishes clinking softly in the sink, the squeak of a window being opened for fresh air. But there were no footsteps, no dishes, no laughter, just the hum of the refrigerator and the slow bubbles forming along the edge of the pot. I poured the coffee into my favorite mug, the one with the chipped rim and the faint outline of the Ohio State Fair logo almost rubbed off. I held it in both hands, letting the warmth bleed into my fingers, and walked back into the living room. I didn't sit. I stood behind the chair and looked around at the space that now held something it never had before: consequence. For years, this room had been a place of routine, a chair to sit in, a table to rest books on, a place to listen to the evening news or doze off before bed. But now it had become something else, a site of confrontation, a battlefield without blood. And yet, despite the finality of what had happened, there was no satisfaction, no triumph. I hadn't won anything. I hadn't taken back what had been lost. All I had done was peel back the curtain on a truth that had waited, patient and still, in the lining of a coat. I picked up the envelope. It was light, emptied, but the name remained, bold, unmistakable, steady. I turned it over in my hands. The paper was warm where his fingers had held it. I wondered if he had shaken when he read it, if he had even made it past the first paragraph, if he had recognized the moment I described, if he had denied it to himself even as the details crawled back into his memory. I set the envelope down again, not in the same place, but slightly to the left. A new position, a new phase. The coat I folded and laid over the back of the chair. I didn't hang it up. I didn't press it back into its old place. It had served its purpose. It no longer needed to hide anything. It was just fabric now, heavy with time, but lighter without the burden. The silence remained, not oppressive, but vast, like the room had expanded, like it no longer needed to hold in what had been kept secret for so long. I walked to the window and looked out over the yard. The trees were bare now, the ground brittle with frost. The wind stirred the remaining leaves in tiny, aimless circles, chasing each other without purpose. The fence needed repair in one corner, where the wood had split. I made a mental note. I might fix it tomorrow, or not. It no longer felt urgent. Back inside, I sat again, this time in the middle of the couch, Helen's old seat. I rarely sat there. It had felt too empty without her, too weighted with memory. But now it felt right, balanced, honest. I closed my eyes and let the stillness settle into me. I didn't feel regret. Not for the letter. Not for the silence. Not even for the years it took to open the seam. What I felt instead was something closer to breath. Not relief, not freedom, but something simpler. Space. The room was empty now in the best way. No pretenses. No veiled remarks. No quiet judgments echoing between furniture. Only stillness. Only time. Only the truth, finally spoken. Not with words, but with presence. And that was enough. The days that followed moved slowly, but not aimlessly. They passed the way cold water drips from an old pipe. Steady, precise, without apology. Nothing dramatic happened. No phone calls. No visits. Not even a message from my daughter. I didn't expect one, and I didn't wait for one either. Some silences are sharp, some are scared, and some, like this, are simply necessary. The envelope remained on the table for 3 days. I didn't move it. It sat there like a fourth chair at a dinner that never started. Every morning, I walked past it. Every evening, I saw it as the last shape in the room before I turned off the light. The air in the house had changed. It didn't feel haunted or bitter, just still. Like the breath after a long run. Like the quiet that follows a slammed door. Not angry, just honest. I didn't wear the coat again. I hung it back in the hall, but not on the same hook. I gave it its own space, slightly apart from the other jackets, as if to mark that its role had changed. It wasn't a vessel anymore. It was a witness, and it had done enough. I spent more time outside. The air had a brittle edge to it, but it felt good on my skin. It reminded me I was still here. I raked leaves in the backyard, trimmed the low branches of the ash tree, repaired the loose hinge on the shed. Small tasks, ordinary work, but they grounded me. My body moved with a kind of slowness that came not from age, but from certainty. There was nothing left to chase. Each movement carried a strange weight, not of burden, but of finality. Every nail I drove into the wood, every bag of mulch I dragged to the garden bed, felt like a statement I was making without words. I didn't need to explain anything to anyone anymore. I had said what needed saying, and I had done it in the only way I knew how, quietly, steadily, on my terms. The power of silence is that it doesn't beg to be heard. It waits. It lets others fill it with whatever they fear or remember or hope for. It doesn't scream. It echoes, and when it does, it carries more than any voice. He didn't return. My son-in-law. Not that week. Not the next. The rhythm of their visits had always been irregular, but this absence felt different. Not accidental. Intentional. I imagined the letter in his desk, folded and hidden, or maybe ripped into pieces and flushed away. But even if the paper was gone, the words were still with him. Words don't disappear when they are read. They live. They root. They remind. I imagined him sitting in his office, hearing footsteps behind him that weren't there. I imagined him watching my daughter's eyes a little more closely, listening to her questions with new caution. I imagined the way a man recalculates when the illusion of invisibility is removed. How carefully he'd weigh each decision now. How quickly he'd glance over his shoulder. That was enough for me. My daughter did call once, a week after they'd left. The phone rang late in the afternoon while I was reading by the window. I saw her name on the screen, let it ring once, then twice, then answered. She asked how I was. I said fine. She asked if I needed anything. I said no. Then silence. Long enough that I heard her breathing. She didn't mention the letter. Neither did I. She said they might not come by for a while, that things were busy, that work was complicated. I told her to take her time. There was no anger in my voice, no sadness, just air. She said okay, and then she said goodbye, That was enough. I returned to my book, but I didn't read. I watched the sun settle into the trees. The light stretched longer that day, golden and cold. The room filled with shadows, not threatening, just full. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper in front of me. Not a journal, not a letter, just blank pages. I didn't write anything. I just sat with it. Sometimes the presence of a page is enough. You don't have to fill it to know what it holds. I thought of Helen, how she used to say that the strongest people don't yell. They just walk away or stay quiet long enough for others to realize what they've lost. She had been right about that. She had been right about him too, before I ever was. I wished I had listened to her voice sooner, but perhaps some voices are meant to echo only after they're gone. I turned off the lights and let the darkness fill the house. It didn't scare me. It welcomed me. It made space for thought. And in that silence, I heard something that had been missing for a long time. The sound of peace returning, step by step, with no fanfare, no trumpet. Just the steady hum of a house that had finally told its story. And a man who didn't need to say anything else. It was early winter when I first noticed the change, not in the house, but in the air between me and the rest of the world. The days had grown short, the mornings colder, but it wasn't the weather that shifted. It was the weight of being watched, the weight of waiting, the weight of keeping things unsaid. That weight was gone now. I woke up each morning without checking the clock. I didn't need to. I no longer lived on appointments or visits. I lived on the pulse of silence, and it carried me better than any calendar ever had. The house held the same shape it always had, the walls unchanged, the corners untouched. But something in its rhythm had altered. It no longer echoed the quiet dread of being forgotten. It echoed something steadier, something done. The coat remained in the hallway, still folded, still resting. I hadn't touched it since the day I laid it over the back of the chair. I passed it every morning on my way to the kitchen. It had stopped being a symbol. It had become a witness, resting quietly, no longer needed to carry what had already been released. I did not expect to see them again soon. And I didn't. Days became weeks, and the sound of tires on gravel remained absent. The windows stayed clear. The mailbox stayed light. It wasn't that I was being ignored. It was that they had nothing left to say. That was the difference. Not avoidance, but reckoning. People respond to truth in two ways. They confront it, or they hide from it. And in that hiding, they show you everything they really are. My daughter texted once or twice after that first call. Short messages, weather talk, health check-ins. I answered with equal brevity, not because I was angry, I wasn't, but because I had no desire to fill the air with words that tried to smooth over what had already been exposed. She knew what she had read, or what she had heard read to her. I didn't ask which. The silence between us had become its own kind of understanding. He never reached out. Of course he didn't. The letter had said everything. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't come back to the truth he could no longer dismiss. He had looked into his name, scrawled in my hand, and found it weighted down with what he had hoped would stay buried. He had read the words and felt the chill not from the paper, but from the mirror it held up. I didn't want his apology. I didn't want him back in the house. What I wanted, I had already received. Silence. Not the silence of denial or of shame, but the silence of acknowledgement. The kind that cannot be shaped into words because it is too thick, too honest, too irreversible. I spent those weeks living slowly. I fixed what needed fixing. I cooked my meals. I raked the last of the leaves. I oiled the hinges of the back gate and patched the screen in the porch door. I read old books. I watched birds. I sat with my thoughts without trying to change them. They no longer stung. Every now and then, I would stand at the window near the front of the house, just for a moment, just long enough to see the road and the space where their car used to park. There was no longing in that gaze, just reflection. I wasn't waiting for anything. I had nothing left to prove. I had already spoken in the only way I knew how, through silence, through a letter, through the kind of patience that grows teeth when someone forgets who you are. One morning, just before Christmas, I opened a drawer I hadn't opened in years. Inside were things Helen had saved: notes, photos, recipes clipped from magazines, bits of twine she'd meant to use for gift wrapping. I sat on the floor with all of it, surrounded by pieces of a life built quietly and lived fully. She had been the keeper of stories. I had only started to understand that now, in her absence. And maybe that's why I had done what I had done. Because she had trusted me to keep what she could not finish. Because sometimes silence needs a companion, a witness, a conclusion. I burned the envelope that night, not out of rage, and not to erase anything, but because its purpose had been fulfilled. I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need to see his name again. I didn't need to keep it as proof. The fire ate the paper slowly. It curled and darkened, the ink vanishing into smoke, and I watched until there was nothing left but a soft bed of ash in the steel pan I had used to carry it outside. When the fire died, I sat alone on the porch, bundled in a heavy sweater, a blanket over my knees, the stars pale and dim above the trees. The night was so still that even the wind felt like it was holding its breath. I breathed out, long and slow. It was the first time in years I had felt completely weightless. The coat stayed in the hallway. The house stayed quiet. And I stayed where I was. Not because I was stuck, but because I was rooted. Because silence, once feared, had become a shield, a testament, a quiet kind of justice that didn't need headlines or punishment or revenge, just space, the kind of space a man can finally live in.